I have long struggled with our reading this morning from the Gospel of Matthew, but not for the reason you might think. It doesn't have to do with the incident of the slaughter of the innocents, as horrific as that is, of course. Unfortunately, it is the kind of thing that has happened again and again throughout the history of the world. No. What I have issues with is the end of the story. Matthew tells us that when Mary and Joseph were on their way back from Egypt, where they had taken refuge from Herod's slaughter, they made a strange course correction. They were heading back to their hometown of Bethlehem, and they decided to redirect. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was ruling Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And after being warned in a dream, he went away to the district of Galilee. There he made his home in a town called Nazareth. So, what's wrong with that? Well, for one thing, it does contradict the story that we know and love from the Gospel of Luke. Luke says that the Holy Family had always been from Nazareth, and that the only reason why Jesus was born in Bethlehem was that he happened to have been born just in the midst of them traveling to Bethlehem for the census. Matthew, in this passage, is saying something quite different. He is saying that the couple had always lived in Bethlehem, but after they returned from Egypt, they made a new home in a strange place in Nazareth. You see, both gospel writers had a problem they needed to solve. They knew that Jesus came from Nazareth. Everybody knew that, but they needed to tell a story of how Jesus was born in Bethlehem. Why? Because they knew that that was where the Messiah had to be born. Luke solved that particular problem with his whole story of the census. Matthew, with this story of a course change on the way back from Egypt, solves it in his way. None of that I actually have a problem with. I get that the gospel writer's main concern was not necessarily to get all of the historical details about Jesus right. They wanted, above all, to make sure they got important theological truths about Jesus across. And so long as they could tell a story where Jesus was born in Bethlehem and came from Nazareth, honestly, they were not that concerned that the other details were entirely correct. No, the problem I have with all of this is this. Matthew's explanation is kind of lame. Look at it. He says that Joseph didn't want to return to Bethlehem because Archelaus, the son of Herod the Great, was ruling there. That much makes perfect sense. Herod had, after all, tried to kill the boy. But it's the part about him choosing and indeed being led by God to go instead to Nazareth that bothers me. Because guess who was ruling over Nazareth? A guy named Herod Antipas, who was also the son of Herod the Great and a full brother of Archelaus. So, if Joseph wanted to avoid dealing with a son of Herod the Great, Nazareth is kind of the last place he wanted to be. So that's the problem I've had with this story. It seems like a pretty weak explanation for why the family ended up in Nazareth. And it seems, in fact, as if either Matthew is ignorant of the fact that Herod Antipas was also a son of Herod the Great, or maybe worse, he's aware of it, but he's kind of just hoping that his readers don't notice. That's the kind of thing that makes me lose respect for a writer. But I've given all of this a lot of thought lately. And honestly, I think that Matthew is a better writer than that. And that he's not ignorant of basic history. And in fact, he always respects his readers. So maybe, just maybe, I've been unfair to old Matthew. And maybe if I give him the benefit of the doubt, I can actually discover there is more to this story of the decision to divert to Nazareth than meets the eye. But what are we supposed to imagine the story really was? Traveling along the King's Highway up the coast of the Mediterranean from Egypt was exhausting at the best of times. But I can tell you that it was doubly so when you were traveling with a toddler. Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Jesus would ask again and again until Joseph could feel his sanity fraying. And what could he say? But that they still had many days yet to go. He didn't blame the boy for being in a hurry. How many times had he told Jesus stories of his old hometown, of the house that he had been born of the noble family that he belonged in? Of course, Jesus would be eager to go there. But the closer they got to Bethlehem, the more doubts Joseph felt. They had fled from Bethlehem in such fear and disarray that he couldn't help but feel anxiety at the very prospect of returning. And it was true, of course, that the tyrant, the man who had tried to kill the boy and who had succeeded in killing so many others, was dead. That news, heard even in Egypt, was what had prompted him to even think of returning in the first place. And the decision had been affirmed in another one of these dreams that had so unerringly led Joseph throughout this whole ordeal. And so the family had packed up and headed out. But the news that was reaching them through fellow travelers on the road was seeming a little bit less reassuring. Word was that Herod the Great had bequeathed the rule of Judea to his son, Archelaus. That in itself was hardly surprising. Of course, he would have wanted to keep the kingdom in his family, but it was the news about the character of this particular son that was alarming. Archelaus had not yet taken his throne. Before that could happen, he would have to go to Rome and seek the emperor's approval. But even as Archelaus prepared to leave, there had been a protest in the temple in Jerusalem. The people had demanded that punishment be carried out against some of his father's worst lieutenants, those who had committed the worst atrocities. And Archelaus had appeared before the people, and he had promised that their concerns would be addressed. But then he left and started drinking and celebrating with his friends. And a few hours later, Archelaus ordered the legions to enter into the temple where the protesters were still waiting for their demands to be met. Reports were that some 3,000 were murdered when they refused to leave. It was not seeming as if the apple had fallen very far from the tree when it came to Herod's son, Archelaus. And so Joseph was feeling tormented with indecision. Every step he took him closer to Judea, closer to the clutches of the son of Herod. What should he do? Should he stop? Should he turn around? Had his dreams finally failed him? As they continued to travel, more news finally reached them from Judea. It seemed that Archelaus had left his country now headed for Rome, where he would plead with the emperor to receive his kingdom. But it also turned out that he was not the only one going. This was the really surprising part. It seemed a lot of people had decided that Archelaus would not make a very good king. It might have had something to do with the 3,000 dead in the temple. Now, of course, rulers have opponents. That in itself is not news. Once you get into a position of power, I can almost guarantee you that someone will hate you for it. No, but the astonishing thing in this case is what people were doing about it. Apparently, there was another delegation that had set sail for Rome to stand in opposition to the very idea of Archelaus receiving his kingdom. And the amazing part was this: the biggest opponent was none other than Archelaus' own brother, Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee. He would actually stand before the emperor and tell him that his own brother must never be king. When Joseph heard this, it made his head spin. I mean, he was used to living in a world where powerful people just got their way, where no one would speak up to those who had power and demand they do better. Was it actually possible that this Herod Antipas could be different? Could be the kind of ruler who actually cared about things like, well, justice? That night, once they had managed to get the boy to sleep, Mary and Joseph sat up late, discussing the difficult choice that was before them. Joseph laid out all his concerns to his wife, who understood exactly what he was talking about because she, of course, had been hearing the same rumors, the same stories. She, like any other mother, of course, had powerful feelings, had a feeling of need to protect her son. We already know, she said, that Archelaus is the same kind of monster that his father was. He's shown that to the world. I don't want to live away from Bethlehem, away from my family and yours. I don't want to lose the house you built for us there. But I don't think I could ever feel safe if I know that Jesus is somewhere within the reach of a man like Archelaus. I also know that Jesus must be raised among his own people, and so I'm not willing to go further afield than Galilee, where I've heard there are many Jewish communities. Yeah, but what about Herod? Herod Antipas, who now rules in Galilee, wondered Joseph. He is no less a son of the tyrant. How can we know that Jesus will be safe in his territory? We can't, Mary admitted. But if he opposes his brother, who we know is horrible, how could he be worse? Joseph felt better after having finally been able to put his concerns into words. But still, he felt unsure. He didn't know what to do as he prepared for sleep that night. Mary's words had at least made him feel as if there might be some way for them to make it through this whole mess. And as he drifted off to sleep, it was Mary's words, "How could he be worse?" that echoed in his mind. He didn't recall what he dreamt that night. But when he awoke, he did feel better about the Galilean option. And so it was that when the family arrived in the bounds of Archelaus' kingdom, they turned away from the main body of travelers, most of whom were heading to Jerusalem, and they turned towards the north. Nazareth was not a big place. It was little more than a village with maybe a couple hundred families in the Galilean hills. No one, least of all the officials of Herod Antipas, were likely to notice them in such a place. Nazareth was small, and yet at the same time was only a few hours away from the city of Sepphoris. That was also something that recommended it. For Sepphoris was Herod's new capital city. He'd only just named it as such, and in fact the city was still under major construction. Joseph might be able to find work there on the various work sites in the city. All the better, he could work under the table, and there would be no documentation. Sure, it wouldn't pay well, but perhaps somehow they would manage to get by. Mary and Joseph were right about Archelaus. His rule over Judea went from bad to worse. So bad that, yes, they heard reports of it even in Nazareth. So extreme was his evil that by the time Jesus came to an age where he was responsible to keep the law, the Romans had already taken the kingdom from him. They just got fed up. They exiled him far away in the west. I wish I could say that Herod Antipas was a better ruler, and maybe he was from a Roman point of view, but he was hardly lacking in evil and cruelty. When John the Baptist spoke out against him, he did not hesitate to arrest him and then take off his head. And when eventually Jesus also captured his attention, Antipas vowed to kill him too. Of course, he wouldn't get the chance, but that's a whole other story. So I'm not really sure that Mary and Joseph's choice worked out for the reasons they had in mind. But you know how it is. When you have to make a choice because you're kind of forced to, it seems that the choices we make have a way of working themselves out in surprising ways. It seemed to me that this story from the Gospel of Matthew was a pretty good one to start a new year with. January is a time when we all tend to look forward and look back and make choices and resolutions in order to set ourselves on a good path for the future. And that's all well and good, but sometimes I think, or that we think, that our decisions have higher stakes than they really do. You know, as if our lives depend on getting that choice right. We feel like we're deciding between living under the evil King Archelaus or the wise and good King Herod Antipas. And at first glance, yeah, that choice might seem so stark. But if we really dig into that choice, just like if we dig into the story about the return from Egypt, it's rarely so clear. We live in a world where many people, like Mary and Joseph, feel as if they have little to no control over who is in charge. We see that, for example, when people say things like, hey, if Trump becomes president again, I'm moving to Canada. Or here in Canada, when people say things like, if Pierre Poilievre becomes prime minister, or maybe if Trudeau gets in again, I'm moving to the U.S. People rarely do what they say because they don't really mean it. It's really just a way of saying that they feel powerless about things. Well, Matthew tells us that Mary and Joseph did it. And I think what Matthew is really saying is that even if they made a choice based on insufficient information to uproot and change their lives, it wasn't exactly the choice they thought it was. But they were apparently under the care of someone who not only had better information, but also apparently had a plan that made it all work out. So make your choices. Make your choices as best you can. That's all any of us can do. And once you've made your choice, don't torture yourself over the options you rejected. That doesn't serve anyone well. Move forward with confidence. Or, to use another word, move forward with faith. Yeah, it probably won't work out exactly as you anticipated, but if you move forward with faith, chances are it will lead to something magnificent, much more magnificent than anything you ever planned on. Lord our God, at the opening of a new year, help us to do our best to make good choices, but help us also to trust in you for all that is beyond our control. Amen.